Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, as a leader of research group which devoted to the migration and refugee issues, I want to thank to the organizers, all management of Central European Academy. Especially thanks go to the Professor Janusz Szilagi and Mrs. Professor Tima Barzo to trust me, to give me this honorable and responsible function. Simultaneously, I would to extreme thank to editor of our book, Mrs. Minister Aniko Reich. Mrs. Minister, thank you very much for the fruitful cooperation, and I hope all the members of our team very well done your tasks, which we will see in the book soon. And our team. And of course, with huge pleasure and incredible respect, what I want to really emphasize, I would to thank all members of this research group. I think in this edition of program, as usually, we created very nice, dynamic, curious, and of course clever research team. I would thank all of us for meetings, for your times, your ideas and inventions in the field of migration and refugee in the broadest sense of this term. To be the leader of the research in this area, in this team especially, it was for me tremendous privilege and awesome scientist adventure. Thank you very much, my friends, for all. But in this moment, it is very nice time for each researchers because we will present our final remarks, thoughts, and proposals as the main results of our research program. If you remember, at the previous conference, in the autumn of the previous year, as a first part of research, I presented the first result of my analytical work on the structure of crime in the area of the migration on the example of Poland. I tried to present the structure and scale of crime in Poland, but in the perspective on the process of migration, assimilation, and the type of crimes committed by foreigners in Poland. Currently, my next task is search for the concept of refugee and migrant in the legal order. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get substance of my speech, let me make a few general remarks, which in my opinion will have an impact on the course of the event in Central Europe. And of course, naturally, this is the link with subject of our program. I have no doubt that there are several challenges that countries are facing at the moment, and more especially in the legislation of states. There are a lot of challenges, of course, but I think the most important ones at the moment are: the first of all is the question of applying the broad sense of the word artificial intelligence and creating a legal basis for its use. It must be foreseen such a way that artificial intelligence can be mastered, that it can benefit from it, but also that threats and can be anticipated has eliminated. Secondly, the question that the political, demographical, economic, cultural, and financial future of the European Union. You will notice that today, it seems to me, in my opinion, of course, it's not longer attractive and appropriate to traditionally divide the left, center, and right, which had its origin from the Great French Revolution. Today, the vision, in my opinion, runs along two elements. The first, the concept of a nation state and independent state, but moving within a certain international organization structure within the European Union, in example. And the second, on contrary, in the transformation of an international organization such as European Union into what is the often said today as a European, maybe superstate. So this is the concept of full federalization in European Union. Thirdly, existential, ideological, and reproductive issue of humankind that is interfering with the start of life, interfering with the end of life, interfering with the duration of life by imposing a certain way of life of human. And finally, fourthly, the problem of migration refugee in its broadest sense, which has become one of the main issues recent years. There is no doubt that migration focuses economic, technical, political issue, and finally, social structure of each state. So let's see, the migration has an impact. For example, artificial intelligence, take a look at the first point, because migrants may soon constitute an important element of the labor market. Migration can have an impact on political and economic issue. It depends on scale of migration. Look at the point 2. After all, migration has an impact on the formation of the social structure of countries. Take a look at the 3rd point. So, dear friends, when we talk about migration here today, let us not forget that people have always been on the move since their beginnings. The process cannot be stopped, but, in my opinion, can be rationally limited and predicted and controlled. There are many reasons for people to move. From the book of Stephen Castles and Mark Miller, Age of Migration, we can read that people have always moved in response to, for example, population growth, climate change, on expansion of production and trade, and the sake of ease of living, of course. The author have called the last century the century of migration. Today, I would like to add to this of more element that favors the movement of people, which he must take into account in this time. An element that was previously unknown. This element is ubiquitous globalization. Dictionary definition of globalization often, as we can see on the slide, often emphasize the links between globalization and migration. That is why I have no doubt that both migration and refugee now have a global dimension. Globalism is, after all, a special feature of today's times. It goes hand in hand with the phenomenon of movement people. For example, commodity market services, production, industry, technology, knowledge, consumption patterns, and mass culture are subject of globalization and directly migration. In this light, I create the first analytical question. What do the process related to the movement of people affect, and what impact do they have of the functioning of the state? To be more specific, migration process include issues affected the security of the state, the social structure of the state, cultural and ideological issues, as well as the issue of the development of the economy of the state, the preservation of tradition, crime policy, and uniformity, and even the preservation of the history of the state. However, I have no doubt that each of the areas just mentioned are key issues to underline the proper functioning of each country. Therefore, the next question arises as to what is the first and most important element of the structure in the state that would make these flows of people to predictable, rational, controlled, and ultimately good for the societies of each state? What is the source of acting the state with connection with phenomenon of movement people? And again, looking at the connection between this element, migration, refugees, society, state, I came to one, in my opinion, a very important area and element of good state functioning. Above all, this element related to migration and refugee are included in, perhaps now a little forgotten concept, reason of state, raison d'être. So the concept of raison de state appears in the work of the Italian philosopher Giovanni Bottero, entitled Della ragione di Stato, while Niccolò Machiavelli is considered to be the creator of the concept of reason of state. So briefly, let's take a look at what is this mythical reason of state. The reason of state can be briefly defined of the overriding the state interests common on the majority of the citizens' organization operating in the state and abroad, but for the benefit of the state. The content of reason of state include independence, sovereignty, and integral territorial integrity of the state, as well as the protection of its security, national identity, social structure and dependencies and development opportunities. I have no doubt that all these elements are affected by migration and refugees. The problem of the movement of people will therefore depart of the reason of state for every country in Europe over the next few decades. Ladies and gentlemen, since we already know that migration process, which ultimately to shape the structure of countries and the social structure of these countries, then another question arises. What tool is needed to state above mentioned, predict, plan, control, and effectively conduct migration and refugee process? Because, what is tool needed? Because this process, I repeat, cannot be avoided. The natural link for control, rationality, and the proper course of migration and refugee is area of law, which we of course, which we here analyze. The law will not only set the basis definition, but also set the limits of the influx of people, put things in order, clarify and normalize these phenomena, making them more controlled and predictable. The law is finally, in terms of controlling the phenomenon of the transfer of people, we express this mentioned reason of state of each country. We must understand in this context law as exponent of reason of state and guardian of proper migration and refugee. As we know, the law regulations are fully of definition and describes. So let's start with the basis, in example with an attempt to legally define the terms process of migration and refugee and migrant and refugee respectively. On the previous my speech, I cited the famous Roman law proverb, homines definito in iure periculosa est. Each definition in law are dangerous, yes it is. For this reason, the attempt of definition term of migration and refugee, we have to be very careful. Define the terms process of migration and refugee are not easy because the law is also not unified structure and has no single level. In the course of my research, I have distinguished three levels of present legal regulation. Level 1, national law. The first level of legal regulation defines these two phenomena is area of national law. The first and source area for me, the most important from the point of view of the reason interest of the state. In this national legislation should be best reflect, for example, the country's migration and refugee needs. It is the above-mentioned needs and requirements of the communities in the countries and the requirements and future challenges of these countries that must be closely synchronized with this migration process or the refugee issue. In this way, each country's own legal system should be creation of define of migration in accordance with own needs and require. Therefore, it is necessary to create an efficient legal mechanism in a given country at the level of national law allowing to the positive use of phenomenon of human movement. The second level is international law. The second level of legal regulation will be the area of international law. Refugee is often unpredictable, unexpected, and often does not depend on the person as it is the case of migration. Migration often has a volitional basis. It depends on the needs and goals of the individual. It is rare to find an objective element here in the sense that the person is forced to make the decision to migrate. In the case of refugee, there are often the factors that force this decision. An example of this warfare, of course. Hence, the role in international legislation is very important, especially in the case of refugee. The third level. Since we are a member of the European Union, the third area will be the legislation of the European Union. Today we are living in a time of European Union legislation has a huge impact on the legislation of the member state of the European Union. It wasn't always this way. It is often forgotten that the European Union legislation must be created on the basis of a serious consensus and compromise reached among the member states of the European Union. Normal, of course. Therefore, national law, in my opinion, should place in the leading role. European Union law must be created with respect of the specifics of the functioning and the organization of a given country, especially when it comes to the issue of the movement of people. After all, this is shared competence of the European Union, and we know that the principle of subsidiarity is activated here. The European Union cannot shape immigration policies without taking into account the needs and capabilities of the given member states. In my opinion, maybe European Union law, it is the case of migration process and refugee process, should be maybe only the soft law based on the general hints, rational and universal value shows only direction of acting, not be strong influences in inner law regulation of each country. In this way, I came to the conclusion that above mentioned level of law regulation, especially national level, have three inside elements which I can be distinguished here, such as Qualification, the reception, and procedure. Qualification refers to the definitional elements needed to determine whether a person can be legally recognized refugee or migrant eligibility criteria, whether someone is fleeing war, looking for a job, whether he or she is a European citizen, etc. The reception, this consists of elements describing the principles of treatment of people undergoing the process of migration refugee. In other words, what are the rules for admitting a foreigner if they have appeared in a given country? And the procedure, this is the third element in example legal norm providing for a model of procedure related to granting, implementing, or receiving a refugee status, implementing the status of a migrant, and norm providing for international protection refugee, or rules of stay for a defined period of time migrant. And the last question, so what is the terminological issue in the area under study here? Let's start at examine the term of refugee. Generally, the concept taken from the system of international law, this is mainly the definition contained in the Geneva Convention, status of refugee, and Euro Protocol, and etc. It is pure international law. It's correct international law, the regulation based on huge consensus of many states. Now, let's examine the term migrant. As far as the term migrant it is difficult to find its universal definitions in the legal order because, in my opinion, phenomenon of migration totally belonging to interior issues of each state. It can be concluded that, for example, in Polish legal system, the appropriate word that defines both a refugee and migrant in terms of meaning is a foreigner. The base of determining a foreigner in Poland is the act of an foreigner. According to this act, on the basis Article 3, foreigner is any person who does not have Polish citizenship. Simple. So we can conclude that the word migrant is certainly directly related to the process of migration. In example, the movement of people from one place to another, most often caused by the search of better, stable, and safe living conditions. In this light, it is already clear that the term migration and refugee are not identical. The only thing that connects the two terms is that both a refugee and a migrant are people who have left their place to residence in their home country, and the reasons for leaving are no longer the same. The differences between migrant and refugee is free will versus coercion. And concluding remarks. The analysis showed several connections. Firstly, concepts such as migration and refugee are not what conceptual network associated with them should have, in my opinion, their origins in national law. The national law, as a regulatory tool of the state, has the power to control to very sensitive and complex phenomena of migration and refugee. By defining the limits permitting of and conducting migration and refugee, national law rationalizes this phenomenon in accordance with aforementioned reason of state, for example. The key is to diagnose the country's real migration needs. The key is to define the framework for migration and prepare appropriate national legislation. Secondly, we don't forget about the globalists, which is currently a significant facilitator for the phenomenon of migration and refugee. Thirdly, the concepts of migrant and refugee are not legally identical. The term refugee has its own legal definition with own history in international law, while the term migrant doesn't know. It's all. Thank you for your attention.